I want to start, if I can, with a moment near the end of the speech that drew some sustained applause when the King said, "As the anthem reminds us, the true North is indeed strong and free." Very subtle. Was that for a Canadian audience or for an American one?
Well, I think everything is for Canadians first and foremost. Speech from the throne for setting out a bold, ambitious plan for Canada, the government's plan. And I think a clear message there that we are strong, we are free, and it's time to reinforce those strengths and those freedoms.
How much progress do you think you've made since the Oval Office meeting with President Trump on resolving some of the issues around trade, in particular the sectoral tariffs?
Well, I would term it this way, since we're at historic moments, epoch-making, to quote the speech from the throne. So to be slightly Churchillian, it was the end of the beginning. The Oval Office was the end of the beginning, reestablishing sovereign-to-sovereign dialogue, much more constructive engagement on some of the big issues on both security and economics. We've had fairly intensive discussions since then. Minister LeBlanc, for example, and our ambassador were down for a number of meetings last week. Conversations continue. We've got more that we need to do before we're satisfied that we have a partnership that is in Canada's interest.
But how would you characterize it? I mean, have you moved closer? I mean, he's going to be in Canada on around the 15th of June for the G7.
Yep.
Could you have a deal by then, a deal by Canada Day, or does this sort of thing that moves into maybe, the CUSMA review time period, which Mexico is now saying could start in September?
I don't think it's in either of our nation's interest for it to drag out that long. I think the issues are getting sharper relief. But we're going to take as much time as necessary to get the right deal for Canada, but no more.
Okay, but so do you agree with the Mexican economy minister, I think, said today, end of September is when CUSMA starts? Is that the period between now and then that you think you can have this resolved with the United States?
I have a slightly different view. I didn't see the specific comments, but the actual CUSMA review period starts in 2026. So look, there are specific issues, the border, fentanyl, tariffs. Canada's made tremendous progress. We're securing our border. You heard the speech from the throne doing even more, another 1,000 border CBSA agents, border services agents, another 1,000 RCMP personnel, a series of other measures which will exhaust our interview time if I go through them to secure the border. So we're making huge progress. The amount of fentanyl going across our border is down 90%. We're less than 0.1% of the U.S. imports of that horrible drug. And the bigger issue now is northbound drugs and guns. So look, we've made a lot of progress. We think we should be moving off of those tariffs. The U.S. should be moving off those tariffs. We are stronger together in autos. The auto pact's been in place my entire life. I'm not that young anymore, so it just shows you the value of being together. Same with steel and aluminum and the other trade challenges. So we want to make direct progress on those issues before we have the broader review of USMCA.
On the relationship, though, overall, Prime Minister, I mean, there seems to have been progress on at least
without question, there is progress, David.
For sure, but on the recognition of sovereignty, right? The president said he still likes the idea of the 51st state, but he's not going to talk about it. Ambassador Hoekstra says
the idea of me playing in the NHL, David, but it's not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely fair. But he still talks about getting the auto sector, the president does. He still has the tariffs against the auto sector and talks about making it economically unviable to make cars in Canada and to move it to the United States. So the economic threat still persists.
I think one of the issues for the United States and by extension for Canada is, can the U.S. auto sector be viable and truly competitive versus Asian competition, particularly coming Chinese competition, but broader global competition? Can it be viable if it's just an American auto sector, a U.S. auto sector? The answer is no. And we have a great auto sector, a great auto parts sector, and that integration of the auto sector is part of what will make North America competitive, and that's what we're working towards.
A line you said with some frequency during the election was, he wants to break us so he can own us. Do you still believe that's true?
I think the president, I won't look into his soul, but I think the president is recognizing, as others are, just how strong and free Canada is. And so if you look at the speech from the throne today, as you did, This is about investing in Canada. This is about building Canada, about making one Canadian economy out of 13. It's about nation-building projects. Each of those and those together give us much, much more than could ever be taken away by trade action. This is a confident country moving forward, and it's an exciting time.
Look, I do want to go through some of the specific measures from the speech from the throne, but just one more on the United States, because when you said the process of deepening integration is over, is that a permanent state of affairs in your view? Is that something about the changing nature of America as a country, or is it specific to this period under President Trump?
Well, I'd roll back 40 years since we're looking at the broader sweep of history, maybe even a little more. A steady process of integration, integrating the auto sector, as I mentioned when I was first born, then moving to broader goods, services, financial services, even some people talking as little as a few years ago about having a customs union with the United States. Greater freedom of movement of labor. That's not going to happen. That reliance, we are seeing the danger of over-reliance on the United States economically and also from a security perspective. So we will, as I said the other day, we will cooperate where necessary, when it's in both of our interests very clearly, but we won't necessarily cooperate. So we, as a confident country, with an ambitious plan, we look outwards. We look to Europe. We look to Asia. We look to new partners that we're going to deepen with. And that's a big element of what we're laying out in the speech.
So when you look to Europe on the security and defense arrangements, is that to sort of augment the ones that exist with the United States or to reduce the reliance there? Is it a hedge or a replacement?
Well, it's both. Diversification depends. Look, and I say it's both. I'm not trying to avoid the question or be clever. The point is we need to do much more to secure our borders, to secure our Arctic, to secure Canada. So we're going to need to spend more. We recognize that. Now we're going to do it in a way that is in the best interests of Canada, with partners on which we can rely, get best value for money, but also make more of that investment here in Canada, so we're growing jobs and livelihoods in our own country. You know this. Some may not have followed as closely. We're spending over 75 cents on every dollar of capital spend for defense goes to the United States. Right. That's not smart. What's better if we spend more at home, if we have diversified partnerships. Look, part of what's been happening in the last few months since I became Prime Minister is a number of conversations of increasing specificity with our major European partners so that we become defense partners with them, that we become part of a very big build-out of their defense industrial base, which will have big benefits for jobs here in Canada. We're making great progress on that, and by Canada Day, we'd like to see something concrete there.
Okay, but you also...
Canada Day is going to be an important date in our calendar.
What do you want to see on Canada Day specifically, sort of on the defense side of things?
So you see a couple of things by Canada Day will happen. First, we have...
Tax cut and free trade, right?
Well, we have a tax cut, middle-class tax cut, and first item that we put on the table as government following being elected is go straight to affordability, that tax cut for 22 million Canadian taxpayers, up to $840 a year for a two-income family. So real money for people delivered on July 1st. That's the first bill. In fact, the Minister of Finance tabled the Ways and Means today in Parliament.
But on defense,
two things. One, we have a summit, EU-Canada summit, just before the NATO summit, third week of June. At the NATO summit, NATO partners are going to be asked to spend more, to do more, for mutual protection. We're going to participate in that. But part of the way we want to participate in that is with new partners, with European partners, yes, with the United States, yes, on our own, in a way that's best for Canada. So look for some agreement and some progress on both of those.
But Mark Rutte said, I believe it was yesterday, that they think the target, forget 3.5%, they want to go maybe as high as 5%. Now, that feels like an aggregate number maybe for the alliance in general, but Canada is not at 2% and won't be till at least 2027, maybe a little bit later. Can you reasonably commit to something even beyond 2 at this point?
I think there's a couple of things. One is we start with results. What is necessary to secure our country? First and foremost, our borders, the Arctic, our sovereignty. Then what do we need to do with our partners in NATO, for a safer world that has an impact on Canada, and that would include our commitments in Ukraine. What do we need to do? Then what could it cost? Then how do we get those costs down, and how do we make sure those expenditures benefit Canada as much as possible? I'm not a fan of picking an arbitrary number. and then trying to figure out how to spend up to it.
Well, we have committed to it as a country.
All of that said, sorry, David, is we are definitely going to have to spend more. We are going to have to spend more sooner. That's one of the reasons why we will have a fall budget, not a budget tomorrow, because we're part of these deeper discussions on the defense side.
Okay, I want to dive into sort of the 7 priorities in your mandate letter. What appears to be a mission-driven approach to government, I would take from that. The list is limited, but each one of them is quite broad in terms of what fits in there. But I want to ask specifically about housing. And now, I know you said you don't want to force down the price of existing houses. You want to reduce the cost, increase the affordability of new builds, but the GST cut at the front end, driving down development fees to make it more affordable while driving up wages, so buying power. It makes it easier to own a home. So, like a simple measure of that is the price-to-income ratio. And over the last 20 years, that has just gotten impossibly unbearable in a lot of big markets. Like 20 years ago in Toronto, it was 5 to 6 times an average salary. Now it's like 11 to 12. What sort of a ratio are you aiming for with this policy? What's an affordability standard for
it comes back into several things. Now you've asked a very complicated question and you've layered it down, and the bottom line is for Canadians, can I get a mortgage? Can I afford the mortgage payments and I can buy the house? Part of what's shifted is the length of those mortgages and the cost of those mortgages. So there's multiple factors that have to happen here. One is we've got to get take-home pay up for Canadians. The first easiest way to do that is to cut taxes now. We're cutting that middle-class tax cut. That's why that's the first thing we're doing. Cut taxes on first-time home buyers, younger Canadians. They're buying a new home, saving up to $50,000. In fact, in some markets, Toronto would be an example, more than $50,000 off the price of a home. That's all, the big money, obviously. Then we need to get supply up in order to get that. At the same time, and we have a very ambitious plan, you'll see that roll out more into the fall setting of Parliament for that to roll out, to get supply up, double the rate of home building, all while growing the economy, because what we need to see is incomes grow. So you combine all of that with mortgage terms, you've got to pull collectively, we've got to get those numbers back, those ratios you quoted, back towards those that you started with.
Well, what's the horizon here? I bought my first house at 28. So if you're a 28-year-old now looking to buy a home, it's tough depending on where you are. Like, how old will you be before it gets to that affordability level?
Look, there is no. Here's an insight. There's no monolithic. There's different types of houses, different types of housing markets. It's a segmented market. First point. Second point is, are we building houses more cheaply? The answer is we have to build those houses more cheaply, and there's several ways to do that. Again, cutting GST on housing, that's one way to make the house more cheaper. Sorry. The second thing is to cut development charges. So we committed in the platform, we will cut development charges in half. Development charges flow through, that's a fancy word for building the infrastructure for houses. It flows through to the end price. So we're looking at another savings on the order of magnitude of that $30,000, $50,000 off the price of houses if we do it and matched, or as we do it and matched by the provinces. Third way you do it is you change how you build houses. So much more effectively, the productivity in the housing sector in Canada has not grown for a quarter century over the period of time that you quote those figures. We've got to get that down. You can do it at scale. You can do it with prefab, modular. You can do it using Canadian timber, Canadian technology. That's what we want to catalyze.
Right. Last
point, David. We're going to focus first and foremost on deeply affordable housing. We have a homelessness problem in this country. I think everybody knows it. There's multiple causes. One way to address it is actually to have deeply affordable housing. We're going to focus in on that. That is a role for government. It's a role for the federal government to catalyze and then move out across the spectrum to affordable housing. Mainstream affordable housing is going to.
But this is a medium term. This is like 5, 7, 8 years. Is that what we're talking about?
We're more ambitious than that, but you have years, not weeks. And you know what? One of the things that's going to characterize this government is being straight with people. Okay, there are things we can do in the short. First off, let's be straight. It's a sunny day. It's beautiful out there. We are in a crisis. We have to get moving. We have to get moving on these major projects. We have to get moving on building one Canadian economy. That is why the First Ministers, the Premiers, and myself are meeting next Sunday in Saskatoon, because we have to get moving. That's why a number of the premiers are here in Ottawa today. That's why some of the Western premiers have banded together on some big ideas that we're really looking forward to getting behind, and on and on. So we got to move, but the idea that, I'm not saying you suggested, that we can just snap our fingers and all of a sudden housing in this country, a housing crisis will be solved overnight. No, that's not going to happen. But that's not a reason to wait. We're going to get going.
Well, it's the same thing with the major projects, right? And you set me up perfectly for where I wanted to go, was looking ahead to Saskatoon with the meeting with appreciate it. You know, it's time to build. It applies to houses, projects, and the relationships. The premiers all have a list of national projects that have big price tags and require federal approval and federal money. I mean, are we going to see
federal approval? I'm not sure about federal money. Yeah.
I think they might think it involves federal money in some cases, right?
Well, so here's if I may. Do you want to finish your? Sorry.
Well, no, I was just wondering, are we going to see specific projects out of Saskatoon? These are the 2 or 3 priorities for this year, next year? What are we going to see in terms of moving this?
What we're signaling in a bold, ambitious plan that's part of the speech from the throne is that we need to move on these nation-building projects. So projects that bring Canada together, projects that diversify our economy, projects that help us export to new markets and really move this economy forward. So yes, the ask of provinces, the ask of the private sector is, which projects do you have that reach those criteria? What we're going to do is fast-track the approval, truly fast-track the approval of those projects. And we are going to name specific projects to which these fast-track approvals apply, so that the country can get moving. Now, part of what we're going to do collectively, in effect, we're going to have a competition with projects. Some projects are good ideas, but they're not ready. Others are ready, but they're bad ideas. Some projects can purely be driven by private sector interests. If the federal government and provincial governments can make approvals quickly, so investors can have the uncertainty, other projects may provide such benefits to our country, in terms of diversification, as an example, and jobs, that it may make sense for there to be some support in some way by the federal and provincial governments. But we look at all of that, we designate the ones we want to, we collectively want to move forward. And when I say we very much include Indigenous partners, Indigenous peoples, because this free, prior, and informed consent applies to all of this and will apply to virtually every project will have an Indigenous component.
Okay, I know you've got to go, but I need to build on the project question. I need to ask you about Alberta, and I need to ask you about the oil and gas sector, because I know you said you want to create an energy superpower, clean and conventional energy. A pipeline is a possibility, but not a certainty. And Alberta would say 1 at minimum is what is needed, maybe 3 to the north, to the east, and to the west. This is what the Premier has said. Is that a reasonable expectation for the Premier of Alberta? And the frustration over this, and you know as someone who grew up in Edmonton, it's driving a lot of the resentment to the national government of Alberta. So as Prime Minister, how do you confront that?
I think there's a couple of things. One is, let's recognize a few facts in terms of pipelines that have been built to Tidewater and projects opening up, whether it's TMX, whether it's Cedar LNG, and beyond. There's a series of LNG projects that more can be done, more should be done, and from our perspective, more will be done. So we will be moving through this process to make these types of projects possible. Now, we don't begin and end the conversation. It's remarkable in some circles, this conversation starts and ends with pipelines.
But that's what it's become politically, right?
No, it's not. No, that is not what it's become politically. That is not what it's become for Canada. Canada as a nation. Canadians want, yes, they want energy pipelines that make sense. They also want grid connections between our clean grids. They want actually less carbon. So they want carbon capture and storage pathways project to move forward. They want broader corridors, for example, Gray's Point in Nunavut, that open up whole swaths of the country to new trade. They want critical minerals so that we are sovereign in the most important components of the future. All of those things are possible. And the more we're doing more of them, the more likely this is going to succeed. That's why these meetings and this process is so important. That's why the legislation that we're putting forward, we will put forward in coming days, is so ambitious. We are in a crisis. We can control our destiny. We are a brave, bold, confident nation. We are the true north, strong and free. but freedom is something you earn every day. And that strength is something we need to reinforce.
But how do you confront the separatist sentiment that is there in Alberta? There's a possibility of a referendum next year. I mean, how do you approach it?
This is the greatest country in the world, and this is a country that works. It's a government that's committed to working with Canadians across the country. And I know you're pressed for time now. You're pressed for time. One of us, we're both pressed for time. I got things to do. We got projects to build. But you know, I was born just north of the oil sands. I grew up just south of the oil sands. When I was born, the oil sands was a concept. And it was the ingenuity of many Albertan engineers and entrepreneurs, and the partnership between the federal government and the provincial government that made the oil sands what they are. This is what we need today. We need all of the actors, private sector, we need research, we need scientists, we need the federal and provincial governments working together. And what's going to happen, and I do feel that this spirit is building, is that we're going to see the projects we're talking about aren't just contained within one province. So it needs multiple provinces, it needs Indigenous partners. And the only way to get it, in my view, is to recognize what a moment that we are in, the need for ambition, the need to work together. And I tell you, David, you saw some of this, I'm sure, in your coverage. I traveled across this great country over the course of the last several months. That's what Canadians want. We're going to go to the wall to get it.
Prime Minister Carney, I know it's a busy day. I appreciate your time today. Thank you, sir.